This is my audience. How would you feel if women never existed? Probably pretty empty and weird, considering you wouldn't have the maternal love or the love of a spouse. In general, without women, we would not be standing here right now. The purpose of this speech is to inform my audience about women's rights throughout the decades. I will be talking about the early 1900s, 1950s, 1960s, and the 80s. Women's rights in the early 1900s was very, very limited. Women really couldn't do much that men could do. During that time, a woman by the name of Susan B. Anthony demanded that the 14th Amendment include a guarantee of the vote for women, since women couldn't vote at the time. Women organizations started to appear because they also wanted broad-based economic and political equality and for social reforms. As jobs started to employ women, all the good-paying jobs started going to the men. However, not all women believed in the equality for the sexes. Women who upheld traditional gender roles argued that politics were improper for women. The challenge to traditional roles, represented by the struggle for political, economic, and social equality, was as threatening to some women as it was to most men. Second thing I'm going to talk about is the women's rights in the 50s and 60s. During this period of time, increasing numbers of married women entered the labor force, but in 1963, the average working woman earned only 63% of what a man was actually making. There was an argument that women often had no outlets for expressions other than finding a husband and married children. Betty Friedan encouraged women to seek their own personal and professional identities rather than have them be defined by the outside male-dominated society. In those times, women were more likely to be hired into the textile and clothing industries started before the war ended. After the war ended, women were expected to take jobs that were more feminine. Lastly, I will talk about women's rights in the 80s. In the 1980s, women's rights focused on a more diverse issue, including reproductive rights, sexual harassment, and the so-called glass ceiling that impedes women in corporate advancement. In the 80s, there were a lot of firsts in history for women. The first female Supreme Court justice, the first female astronaut, and the first women to be included on a major ticket for the U.S. presidency. I hope that this speech informed you about the women's rights in the 1900s, 1950s, and 60s, and the 1980s. I will leave you with a quote from an Indian feminist, Malala. "We cannot succeed when half of us are held back."